Hey everybody, this is Sam and welcome back to Post-Production Level 1. This is going to be Lesson 2 and we're going to be going over dynamic processing. So let's just jump on in. So the lesson overview is going to go over what is dynamic processing and compression and how do we use a compressor. Okay, so what is dynamic processing? Well, dynamic processing is any style of processing that alters and or affects how loud or how quiet a source can be. Okay, note, dynamic processing is also known as compression. Okay. And the question to answer is, how do I use a compressor? Well, any compressor can be used in many ways, but for this lesson, we will focus on the controls of two types of compressors, fixed threshold and variable threshold. So, what is a threshold? Well, a compressor's threshold is the line in the sand that when passed, the signal becomes compressed. And we can see this down here. So we actually have an uncompressed signal. It goes past the threshold and then it becomes compressed. Okay. And just to note, the signal flow on this one is going from A to B. And so what's a fixed threshold versus a variable threshold? Well, a fixed threshold is exactly what it sounds like. The threshold just doesn't move, okay? And a variable threshold is exactly the opposite. The threshold can be adjusted. And here are some graphics to demonstrate that. We have a fixed threshold, meaning it's locked in, and the uncompressed signal has to be driven into the threshold to become compressed, okay? And then the variable threshold actually can adjust that threshold going back and forth so the threshold can come closer to the uncompressed signal to make it compressed. Okay. So to that, it should be stated that when the signal does go past the threshold in either fixed threshold or a variable threshold compressor, they will react the same way. Okay, so that brings us to compressor controls. Okay, so we have input gain, attack, release, and ratio. Okay, and there are a couple more. However, these are the basic ones that you really need to focus on when you're using a compressor. Okay, so that being said, the input gain is going to control the level before the threshold. These are more common on fixed thresholds because that signal has to be driven into that threshold. Okay. The attack is how long it takes for the compressor to engage once the threshold is crossed. Okay. And the release is how long it takes for a compressed signal to become uncompressed after going underneath the threshold. And the ratio is how much compression occurs when the signal crosses the threshold, or when the signal actually becomes compressed. Okay, so we have a fixed threshold here. We've got the uncompressed signal, which goes into the input gain, which once we turn it up, will hit that threshold. And that threshold will compress the signal. However, the attack time gives us that little window of opportunity, typically in milliseconds, where the compressor won't turn on. Okay, so if I have 10 milliseconds and something crosses that threshold, I have 10 milliseconds before that signal becomes compressed. And again, as a reminder, the signal flow is going from A to B. And here's an example of a variable threshold compressor. We have the uncompressed signal here, which is going towards that threshold. However, that threshold can also work its way back to that uncompressed signal to make it compressed once it crosses the threshold. And then the attack time is exactly the same as it would be for a fixed threshold compressor. And again, we're going from A to B. Okay. And the question to think on is, how can I use controls of a compressor to balance a performance? Note, we will go over this in level 2, but we'll also touch upon it in the lectures for this level. To that, good job on this lesson. Let's go to the next one.